Welcome everyone to this webinar on MedTech 2.0, where we bridge traditional market expertise with AI innovation. And the goal of this session is to give you a clear understanding what is required if you bring a new product to market, a new company to market, what kind of market intelligence is needed, and what are the current barriers that you're facing, and how can you address those barriers using AI. And I'm very happy to have Richard Charter here in this call. He is filling in the spot of Praful, who could not make it. Richard brings in a lot of experience on market intelligence, and he is currently senior advisor at Vamstar, helping companies using AI to get market intelligence. And we also have Tim Farnham, the marketing director, who's the moderator of this webinar and helping us to manage everything. So maybe Richard, you can quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Marcel. Yeah, my name is Richard Charter. I'm a senior advisor at Vamstar. I've got about 20 years of financial and health economics experience, focusing exclusively on MedTech companies. So not on the pharmaceutical side of things, because as you'll see in the presentation, I think there's a lot of differences between pharma and MedTech. I used to lead the MedTech market access function at a major medical technology company on both the diabetes care side as well as the medication delivery side. I've also led a 25-person team of consultants at a mid-size consulting company as well, where we supported hundreds of companies on their commercialization strategies. So it's very nice to see everyone, and thanks, Marcel, for the time and the opportunity.
Hey, you're very welcome. My name is Marcel. I'm the founder of Foxfire, the Foxfire Academy, where we have a masterclass on how to build, grow your medical device distribution network. And I see some old colleagues already joining this call as well. What we hope to give to you in this meeting is a lot of information and value on the background of how the MedTech market is changing. And let's dive in already. What we see in the evolving MedTech market is that there are a couple of aspects quickly changing. For example, regulatory complexity. With the MDR in Europe, countries outside Europe are even avoiding launching their products in Europe and going to other areas first. The regulatory is quite a challenge these days. Secondly, increased competition with new startup and scale-ups continuously coming to the field with new products, new ways of services. Shifting buyer behavior, where more and more hospitals and purchasing groups use value-based procurement. And maybe, Richard, that's something that you can talk to as well. What do you see as what is evolving in the MedTech market these days?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, we'll see a number of slides on this, but really the MedTech market has evolved demonstrably in the last sort of 20, 30 years. It used to be market access was regulatory approval. Now we're seeing literally a graveyard of companies which have thought through their regulatory process and how to most effectively get that regulatory approval as quick as possible, but they haven't thought through or planned appropriately for the commercialization after regulatory approval. And similar to what we saw in the pharmaceutical industry, that means that market access is now no longer only regulatory approval. It's still a really important hurdle, but you also need to get payer or procurement or HTA approval as well, because that gives you reimbursement. Right. And reimbursement drives that revenue that is so critical to every startup. So, and that's just one area of regulation, right? We're now seeing the HTA regulation come in. We're seeing GDPR regulations come in, AI regulations come in, cybersecurity regulations come in, environmental sustainability regulation coming in. So the skills and the skills and capabilities needed 20 years ago, they're demonstrably different to what they are now.
Right.
So I think one of the key things.
And maybe the slide, or the first slide, really speaks to this. I recently had someone from a university present this, the two values of that for MedTech companies. What we see is that from the start of an idea, that's the moment when you also start doing a market analysis. Hey, is this a valid, a feasible product? Can we make money of it? And then you spend 5-6 years on product development and trying to bring it to the market and get, for example, CE approval. Already 80% of the companies fail in that phase of the business. Then bringing it to commercialization, what you just mentioned, Richard, another 70% fail to commercialize their products in the next 5 years. And I think this illustrates the whys of why Vamstar and why Foxfire are trying to help the industry to bridge those valleys of death, and specifically for this call, the commercialization valley of death. So that being said, that was on the key markets to entry. Where do you see, Richard, the possibilities in bridging that gap from using latest technologies?
When technologies are being developed now through increased regulatory, like MDR or IVDR regulations, what we're seeing is that increased evidence requirement, right? So things like the post-market clinical follow-up, PMCF, by linking that at the product development phase through to commercialization. And again, I've got a slide on this, we'll see it shortly. You can spend a little bit more upfront to increase the evidence required for regulatory approval, but then the successful companies are linking that to what they need for evidence perspective for commercialization as well. And that really is the critical enabler here, because if you've got 100 companies and 80% fail at product development, you're down to 20. If a further 70% fail, that's 6 companies in every 100 that are making it through these two valleys. The question then becomes, that's 94 companies and 94 technologies that are not reaching the patients who need these solutions. So you've got to think through the commercialization, not just for your own success as a company, but for healthcare systems, for the patients who need them, and the overall ecosystem itself. So it really does come down to evidence in the early days.
Right. So what you say, there are a lot of misaligned marketing strategies these days as well.
Absolutely.
I had an example. I was helping a MedTech company that developed a wounds treatment product. They had done a market study 6 years ago, spoke with key opinion leaders who told them, hey, we want to try this product. Then they closed up themselves in a laboratory, developing the products in splendid isolation, only to discover after 5-6 years, when they were ready to go to market, that the market had completely changed. Yes. That the key opinion leaders were not interested anymore. So it also emphasized the importance that once you do a market study before you start really into the product development, that you continue keeping in touch with the market. And that's also where the market is shifting much faster and real-time information becomes crucial.
Definitely. Yeah. And I would suggest that it's not only staying in touch with the market, it's staying in touch with the right stakeholders in the market on a continuous basis as well, right? Quite often, and I've seen the exact same thing you've seen, where a company goes through an exercise to understand the unmet need, if you will, but they're only asking, for example, the clinicians or the patients. You still got to ask the payers or the procurement what they need and what they're prepared to fund as well, right? That's why I think having an advisory board that represents all stakeholders is absolutely critical for you to go to sense check your ideas as you develop them. I think you're spot on, Marcel.
Right. Okay. So given these challenges, how are companies adapting their market entry strategies? What do you see is shifting in the market, Richard?
So from the company perspective, again, I think that the regulations are forcing this, right? And again, when I say regulation, I do not only mean CE marking, but the regulations themselves are changing. So the capabilities are becoming far more complex. Again, if we go back 20 years ago, it used to be set up a sales team, engage with the clinicians only, right? And then drive the product through clinician engagement. But now even the clinicians don't even have access to some technologies. If procurement hasn't paid for it to be on the shelves, payers haven't decided to cover it, and HTA organizations haven't decided that it's cost effective. So the companies that are succeeding are the ones that are linking all of those different perspectives. And again, a lot of it comes down to having that input from the stakeholders along the product life cycle, such that you can iterate and act as needed for all the different stakeholder perspectives.
All right. So what do you suggest then? Because when you are entering the market with a new product, you still need to have that traditional insight and the traditional aspect. So do you have some suggestions on how smaller companies can do this? Because it sounds like you need quite a team and a lot of resources to do just what you just mentioned.
Yeah, I'll actually challenge that in one way. I don't necessarily think you need a lot of resources if you start up front doing the both clinical, economic, and societal dimensions to your technology, right?
Okay.
If it becomes iterative and you start it from the beginning and you also use an AI first approach, right? Offload a lot of the mundane tasks that take up an awful lot of your time, lever the agentic AI tools that can really bring that efficiency to any organization, not just for a MedTech developer, but have all of those different stakeholders brought in early on. I mean, in many cases, it's nothing more at the early stages than simply saying, here's our clinical unmet need. Just have another column on your product development sheet that says, here's the economic unmet need, and here are the advisors we have to validate this, right? So again, it's the tools, AI, it's the people, the clinicians and the payers that you need to have the perspective of, and bringing those two together. And again, we'll get into this as we go through the presentation with some clear examples, but having those perspectives are key. And then final to that, and again, this is also brings the AI into it, is the correct market intelligence, right? What are the market analytics that you have? We see a lot of individuals go in and say, okay, I'm going to launch a product in, let's say, diabetes. Okay, well, you got to segment that market by type 1, type 2, maybe even gestational diabetes, what the sub-patient profiles are on all of this. It really has to be done from an evidence and analytics strong approach right up front. And the earlier you start that, the less you need to reinvent the wheel down the road and spend more money.
Right. So if I can summarize that, Richard, what you're actually saying is that companies should, in their product development procedures and SOPs that they have already from the very first start, but before design review 1, include the economic aspects of the products, just like you explained.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, include it early, include it often. I mean, I advise on a number of startups. Some of them actually do on a pro bono basis, depending on the technology. And I literally sit down with them and I say, look, you don't need to do anything more here except just consider what those economics are behind the technology. Clinical unmet need is one thing, economics are another. But again, find ways to drive efficiency into that business by leveraging some of the AI tools and building an AI first company. Don't try and retrofit it back in afterwards, but start often with those artificial intelligence tools as well.
Right. Okay. So because in the preparation of this webinar, I realized that the cost of entering a market, you need to invest in market intelligence, but the cost of not investing in market intelligence will eventually be much higher, because you will learn that when you bring it to the market, that it will limit your regulatory approval, it will limit your positioning in the market facing the competition. So what you just said is confirming that not having the right market intelligence will result in higher cost and a higher risk and chance of failing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes back to the example you gave earlier of the wound care company. If you don't have the right market analytics and the market moves on, and it's happening very quickly in this environment with both regulations and technological advancement, if you haven't got a good sense check on the market, then you're going to struggle. So.
Right. So if you would summarize the different types of market intelligence that you would need. We already mentioned you need to understand the regulatory landscape.
Yeah.
Secondly, you need to understand the pricing in the specific markets. So not just ballpark, the global world. It needs to be very specific for the countries, maybe even the regions. You need to look at reimbursement trends. You need to look at competitors and their profiles, their market saturation, demand signals, buyer behavior. And then once you have that, you need to find the right local distributors and partnerships to do all of this.
Yeah.
It's a lot. But I will be interesting, and maybe this is the time that you share a couple of your slides, Richard, how you are addressing this, because you have been doing it the traditional way before AI became popular. So you know the difference between the traditional one and the new way. So I would like you to share more of that right now.
Yeah, so thanks for that. I mean, I have got a couple slides, as I mentioned. And really, it's bridging traditional market expertise with agentic AI innovation, right? And that agentic word is super important because that gives agency over the AI to offload some of that decision making or some of the minute tasks that you need to still do, as we go through, and you'll start to see this. So first off, there's a QR code you'll see on many of the slides. That's our State of the MedTech report. Please feel free to QR code that, download it, have a look at it. There's some other content on our website as well. Some of it is more how we actually lever the artificial intelligence solutions for things like pricing, but download those, take a look, register with us, and we can start sending you that content if in fact you're curious. So please do. I'm going to skip over my introduction because I want to get right into this, but I often say that, although you need the right market intelligence and although you need the right marketing tools and the right approach to this, again, I would suggest that in early days, from a company perspective, I'm not talking about clinical unmet need, I'm not talking about the product itself, but from the going concern of the company itself, revenue is arguably the most important number. Without revenue, you don't have a business, right? Now, revenue, when you break it down, consists of only two variables. So the question becomes, how do you manage those two variables in a simple way? We all know that volume is important, right? So there's things like tender notices, there's institutional sales records, there's company annual report. These are the things where you can start to understand how the volume fits in. The second part of the revenue equation is price. Revenue equals price times volume, right? So each of these two variables have got different types of things. Now, what we're going to walk through today is how you go from data orchestration through to syndicate reports through to bespoke reporting. Okay. And what does it mean across the product lifecycle and across the technology launch as in fact you're going through it? Because what you need to get to in the end, again, is not product launch from regulatory perspective, but you need to have that product adopted in the market. And the only way to get it adopted in the market is through some form of pricing and reimbursement discussion with the correct stakeholders. So keep this in mind as we go through, okay? I've already introduced myself, so I'm not going to go into this, but I am a senior advisor at Vamstar. And if we look at, and again, we talked about this before, Marcel. So if we look at the changing medtech landscape, it has changed demonstrably over the last 20 years, right? So what we're focusing here is minimizing that time to funding. And I don't mean venture funding here. I mean funding of your technologies by the people that are going to use it, okay? So when I say funding, I mean reimbursement. And this may look like a lot on this slide, but again, speaking to your valley of death, this is that commercial valley of death that we see, right? So this will be after the regulatory, and you can see the drop in it there, where once we get CE marking, right, that product is essentially locked in the market. And we see two basic ways, right? One is through substantial equivalence. The other one is through some sort of breakthrough or de novo device. Once you have that, then you've got to get that reimbursement done. And how you minimize that time is critical to what we're talking about here. If you look at the bottom there where you see evidence generation, it really does become contingent on how well you run that. And that was one of the questions, Marcel, that we asked earlier, right? PMCF evaluations are now something that are critical at the regulatory stage. Thinking through how to link those to reimbursement is crucial, right? Because the regulations that we're seeing coming out are fast and furious. We've got medical device and IVDR regulations. We've got EU HTA regulations. We've got procurement directives as well, which change how you engage with procurement teams. We've got things like the EU Green Deal and how you incorporate environmental sustainability into this. We've got digital regulations as well, like GDPR, the AI Act, and even the EU Health Data Space. All of these will impact the commercialization of your technology. Just the MDR and IVDR alone has got the rationale behind it and then the impact to it. But the one that I've highlighted here really is stricter requirements for clinical evidence and post-market surveillance really are going to have a significant impact on that time to commercialization. And artificial intelligence can be deployed across all of this such that all of these different legislative landscapes, all of the different market landscapes, all of these can be synthesized in a way that becomes far more efficient. Rather than hiring a team of 20, 30 individuals to go through all the regulatory approvals that you need and doing all of the literature reviews and things like this, artificial intelligence can now take an awful lot of this off the table. And that's where Vamstar focuses. So inclusive of the changing medtech landscape, and I'm going to explain this little chart in the middle as quickly and as simply as I possibly can. But really all this simply says is we need to match supply and demand, right? MedTech companies or potential MedTech companies are the suppliers, and then the demand comes from both patients and the payers. We need to optimize this in some key way. The evidence, right? And this is, again, we're going to come into how AI can support this in a moment. Evidence for CE marking consists of two things. One, is the product safe and is it effective? Is it going to kill anybody? Is it going to do what it says it's going to do, right? That's what the regulatory question is addressing. What it does not address is the comparative effectiveness, which is where reimbursement, payers, procurement, so on and so forth come in. And those are questions that you can see on the left-hand side there. Things like, what is the payer unmet need? How is your solution better than the existing standard of care? Can the system even afford your solution? These are the questions that your evidence needs to address. And again, coming back, Marcel, to the questions you asked earlier, how can AI enable more rapid decision-making and more rapid articulation of answers to these questions for the stakeholders that are so important? Because each of these 6 things here make the MedTech space incredibly unique and in some cases challenging to engage with payers. They're used to dealing with pharmaceutical companies that have got much stronger, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials. They don't have the user learning curve. They don't have the organizational impact that MedTech companies typically have. So the key takeaway here is, for industry, the key risk is certainty and timing of revenue. For payers, the risk is the uncertainty of cost and value for money. And for providers, as in hospital groups, the risk is cost, patient, and population outcomes. We need to bridge these through CE marking evidence, through reimbursement evidence in the scope of the different changes here. All right. Now, I've gone through this slide very, very quickly. There's a lot more I could talk about, but please follow up with me afterwards or with Marcel if you like, and we can answer some questions. But this really speaks to the heart of why the MedTech industry can become challenging when it comes to commercialization. So if we look at this slide again, let's look at it through a different lens on how AI embeds itself into this process, right? So at Vamstar, what we do is, and again, this is taking the vast amounts of data that are in the public domain and some that we have access to that we can orchestrate the data from as well. It comes down to 4 main things. First one is data orchestration across 109 languages and millions of data sources, right? Just by virtue of being able to consolidate and standardize the data into a common sort of database, if you will, that we can lever, we can then provide insights that are frankly far beyond anything that anyone would ever be able to do. The only way we can do this is through AI and through the ontology and the natural language processing that is dedicated to the healthcare space. And that's how we are able to data enrich and normalize and have some standardization of what goes into it. Once we have that in place, then we can start to generate the intelligence and analytics, which can start to become some of these real-time dashboards to give you on-the-spot decision-making such that, again, you can focus on your goal of minimizing time to funding. Once we have those dashboards in place, then it can start to become predictive. Then it can start to become Gen AI powered. That's where the insights can start to come, and you can start to offload some of this decision-making to something that is dedicated explicitly towards doing that. Like 3-5 years ago, this was just an idea. This was not even something we could actually do. Vamstar is now doing this, and we're seeing immense success, and I'll show you some numbers in a moment on this. So let me pause there for a second, Marcel, and say, before we get into the AI-enabled strategy in more detail on how we do it, we've covered the MedTech landscape, and we've gone through some of the concepts you wanted to cover. Are there any questions that either you or the audience wanted to ask?
Well, the question that comes to mind, because you mentioned a lot of reimbursement and regulatory, but it was my understanding that the focus of Vamstar is more on the market information, or is it also including the regulatory aspects?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, we typically do not focus on the regulatory side, but what I am advocating for is that you keep a view to what needs to happen at commercialization at the regulatory phase. If you're an early stage startup, chances are, and I've seen this before, you get almost myopically focused on that regulatory approval. What I'm advocating for here is build your commercialization strategy to include the reimbursement process right from the beginning in an AI first manner, right? Don't go through regulatory approval doing it the old traditional way and then say, okay, now we're at commercialization. Now we're going to start to do things with AI embedded into it. Now we're going to start to be thinking about the commercialization strategy. What I'm saying is think about it as a holistic process with the end state being reimbursement and not only regulatory approval. So in essence, we turn those 2 valley of deaths into a smaller valley of death that's only 1 instead of 2. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense.
Perfect.
Right.
So I can continue here if you like, Marcel.
Yeah, well, there is a user question, but I suggest we address that later on.
Okay.
Because it might be covered already in your next topic, Richard.
Perfect. Thanks. I cannot see the question, so jump in when you want me to address it.
Yeah,
Okay?
all right.
So let's get into a little bit about the AI-enabled strategy for Vamstar. So, and I want to be clear about this as well. And this is not entirely dissimilar to any other IT project, if you will. And again, a lot of IT projects fail for the same reasons that are on the screen here. And artificial intelligence can fall into this trap if you're not careful. But the first reason why 85% of AI projects fail to deliver any value is because there's unclear business objectives, right? Yes, you're a startup. Yes, the company or even an SME that's just going through commercialization now, but be clear about why you want to do what it is you're doing. It's worth having an expert advisory team like Vamstar come in, sit down with you and walk through what exactly you want to accomplish by enabling anything in an AI manner. Without that, you're honestly setting yourself up to fail because you'll be trying to backfill a ton of different solutions into things that might not be adding value and will end up leading you to burn cash. So be clear about business objectives up front. Second one is poor data quality. I've touched on this already. Without the data sources and the data orchestration and standardization, you will not get anywhere. All you'll have done is you'll have much more conviction about making bad decisions. And that's not something we want to do in healthcare. Lack of collaboration between teams. Again, depending on the size of your company, this will be easier for some rather than others, but both internal and external teams need to have transparency and collaboration. If it's one thing I'll say about artificial intelligence in healthcare overall, it's that it can really break down these barriers and the silos, and transparency is coming. Fewer silos is coming. Fewer hierarchies are coming. So the more you collaborate now, the easier it'll be later on. And then the final one, and actually this is borrowed from the old balanced scorecard days, which are 1992 invented Harvard Business Review types of solutions, which I think are tremendously valuable still. And that comes down to lack of talent. Regardless of how big your team is, make sure that they're engaging with companies like Vamstar to up their talent and knowledge levels on things like artificial intelligence. This is moving so quickly that it's something that you'll very, very rapidly fall behind on if you're not careful. Okay. So how does Vamstar do this? So very quickly, and I'm not going to go through the text on the slide, I'm going to highlight the three numbers. Number one, we've got 86,000 buyers with 40 million contracts for a value of 780 billion per day that we are orchestrating and backfilling into a database that we can then provide market intelligence and market insights for you on. There are very few companies that can do this. Now, again, what I mentioned earlier, not only do you need to orchestrate that data and standardize it, but you then need to turn into insights and then into predictive analytics. That is what Vamstar can do. Those numbers on the right-hand side of the page are powerful. They really give you a data-driven focus to the entire commercialization process for your team. But what I really like about it as well, it's not just those data sources in 1 or 2 countries, it's across 106 countries on every single continent, or almost every continent. We don't have Antarctica, but on every single continent. So, by looking at all of these different countries, you can then very quickly start to determine your launch cadence such that you can most effectively deploy your sometimes limited resources as you're going. All right. So again, reach out to us if you've got a dedicated need in any of these countries, because we do have data from them. But what's really important is that, as I mentioned, as you go through the data orchestration, the AI implementation, and create that AI-powered workflow, you do need to have a subject matter expert in the mix here. Again, healthcare is one of the most regulated industries. A wrong decision can literally kill someone. So what's really important is that you have that human oversight to everything that is done, whether it be the CEO providing the final buy-in, whether it be your chief commercial officers providing that commercial lens. You do need a subject matter expert to guide this entire process. In essence, if you're not comfortable putting it on the desk of the payer and knowing exactly what's in there, then you may not want to be putting it down on paper, right? That's where the subject matter experts can validate everything that comes out of this artificial intelligence solution and really bring it to life, because there's always nuance in healthcare. It is, again, siloed, hierarchical, and it is undoubtedly much more regulated. So you do need to have that subject matter overlay in all of this. So that's one of the things that I believe sets Vamstar apart, rather than just pushing everything out through the machine, so to speak. Now, here's where the market intelligence starts to come to life and how we bring it into the operations of the company itself. So again, the AI-enabled platform typically starts with clear objectives, data orchestration, data enrichment, intelligence and analytics, so on and so forth, as I already mentioned. Now, the commercialization function, right, Typically it has things like unmet need, launch sequencing, clinical and economic evidence, stakeholder engagement, how you synthesize that evidence, and then have the pricing and reimbursement discussions. Those are your traditional market access policies and teams. But by bringing these two together, what you end up with is a tech-enabled market access pricing and policy team. And this is where it really comes to life, and you drive so much efficiency out of what is done versus the standard that we're seeing significant uptake in terms of both operational margin and revenue improvement. And again, we'll come into some of that in a moment. Because the vast majority of the job, certainly on the market intelligence side, comes down to collecting, organizing, joining, and cleaning the data. But as mentioned earlier, one of the biggest pitfalls to AI implementation is that if you don't have good data, you're just going to, like I said, be more confident in making bad decisions. So you have to find a way to orchestrate, structure, and manage this data. And again, that's what Vamstar has done through the sources that we highlighted. So one of the ways that we do this from the market intelligence, and I think, Marcel, you asked this question, what are some of the areas that we can look at for market intelligence, is things like payer mix data, right? It's competitive environment. It's provider behavior, so the hospitals and how they're uptaking things through the channel, including the distribution strategy, Marcel, which is your expertise. Through the payer behavior, right? What's changing with them? What evidence do they require? Where are the most prioritized unmet needs and things like this? And then also on the procurement side, so the contracting, tenders, and discounts. And then also very importantly, because it overarches everything done in healthcare, that is the policy and environmental horizon. So by going through and understanding each of those, we can start to get much more granular, which creates a lot of insights for our clients. So that would include things like tender platforms, distributor insights, and even payer and KOL insights. All right. So this gets a little bit more technical here, so I'm going to go through this even quicker. But again, what this requires as we go one level deeper on the data orchestration is looking at the internal data. So you've got your sets of data, then you've got your external data, which is where we can go to validate things. We then turn that into, as I said, those tools earlier, which become what will become your dashboards and your analytics. And we can then start to turn this into something that your key business questions can then address, right? Like, is my pricing optimized? Can I monitor business performance from gross to net across different markets? What is my portfolio ROI? Am I focusing on the right areas within the portfolio of solutions my MedTech company has? And this is done through these sort of sparring partners, which I'll show you in a minute, which are things like market analytics. So you can stress test that through a chat GPT type of solution on market analytics, or even things like net pricing and shortage trackers. Where should I be pivoting to get those most effective alignment of my solutions to the unmet needs in the market? But moving through all of this is where it becomes very important. And as I said, the AI-enabled sparring partners. I mean, imagine you had a chat GPT or a Microsoft Copilot to just put out ideas into that had a healthcare dedicated large language model behind it, such that you could have, again, literally that sparring partner in your office whenever you needed an idea. That's what Vamstar can provide for you. We can do this across tendering. We can do this across pricing, and we can do this across value overall. And each of these are at unique points of the business life cycle and are things that we can offer to make sure that you're commercializing in a far more effective way. All right. Now, again,
hey, Richard,
go ahead. Sorry.
Take a question, because you're using a lot of existing data from the market. But what if you bring a completely new, revolutionary, innovative product to the market that doesn't have that's really new? How would a Vamstar, the data, be useful for that new product?
Yeah. So again, we need to make sure we're at the right point of the product life cycle, right? But whenever you're putting a technology into a market, right, the direct competitors are not the only markets that you need to analyze. You might need to analyze what the existing procedures are for that intervention as well, right? So there's a whole ton of other stuff that will need to be analyzed. Again, you cannot only focus directly on what your technology does, you need to focus on the clinicians that use it, the physicians. You need to focus on the providers and the hospitals and how they implement it and how they pay for it. You need to focus on the payers and how they're making that decision making. You need to focus on the procurement teams who are going to buy it, the policymakers who are determining coverage, and the patients that are going to use it as well. And regardless of how new or innovative your technology is, there will always be something out there that is currently being used, even if it's nothing, right? But there's still something you need to understand in order to determine what that unmet need is. So, and that's where, in an extreme case of what you're talking about, that's where a prospective registry or database can become very important, because you can actually build the data as you go. You're not burdened by legacy data points. And then you can start to lever that prospective database to backfill some of this, such that you can then start to run predictive analytics off of it. So there's always something that you need to mine. The question is, what is it, and what's the most effective way of doing it?
Right.
Okay. Any other questions, Marcel, or should I keep going?
No, we're 40 minutes in, so I don't know how many slides you have left, Richard.
Yeah, I'll start to accelerate here, because I do want to get to an example in a moment, then we can open up to more Q&A. But again, what I want to emphasize through this slide here is that, all the AI tools are supported and validated by experts, whether that be individual subject matter experts or through advisory boards themselves. But the idea here is, rather than starting from a top-down assumption perspective where you interview 2 or 3 people and hope that the strategy applies to everyone, what Vamstar can offer is a bottom-up data aggregated approach, and you validate those data points in the aggregated data with the advisory board themselves, such that you're doing it in a much more data-driven and holistic approach. And I think that's a key differentiation here, because if you look at that blue box in the bottom right corner, the final report on strategic recommendation is driven by AI and machine learning data sources, but is complemented through subject matter experts. And that's where we start to get into the price waterfall components, and we can start to see the average retail prices, how they fit versus the list prices, and how they are adjusted through discounts through the channel, Marcel, which is your distribution strategy component, and how that translates essentially to the transfer prices through to the cost of goods sold for the technology, such that you're optimizing your profitability across each of the data points. And that's where we start to see, these are some of the numbers that we've seen from clients. We see an uplift in revenue of over $1 million US. We see a win rate of over 72% on tenders and bids and reimbursement discussions had. And we see opportunities for growth that bolster both revenue and profit margins. And that's really where each of these start to come in, and we deliver them through these types of solutions. So, I mean, Marcel, I'll pause there. And this is sort of the offer that we can do on the commercialization side of things. Tell me what your thoughts are, and how can I answer some of the questions that people have put out there. So.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks a lot, Richard, for sharing this, because many of us, and me partially included, when it comes to AI, the first thing that comes to mind is ChatGPT and maybe Midjourney for making nice images and such. But you're demonstrating the real value of it, and the real backbone of and what it takes to get an answer from AI that is not just typing in a question, but that the input matters, and how you convert the input into data that makes sense and that's logical. So, and it really clarified a lot to me, at least, Richard. There was one question from the audience: what steps do company typically fail to do that increase the chances of falling into these valleys of death?
Yeah, again, it's exactly what I mentioned, and that is it's a too laser focused approach only on regulatory approval, right? The MedTech market is one of the most innovative in the world, right? Certainly across Europe, where the number of patents filed, does not translate into products launched, right? And even fewer of those, when I say launch, regulatory approval, and even fewer of those actually get reimbursement. So if you take the number of patents filed, the number of products getting regulatory approval, and then the number of products getting actually reimbursed, I mean, we're probably talking about the 1 in 10,000 number that we see in the pharmaceutical space, right? And to me, I'm perpetually amazed how, and again, I can understand why, but what I don't understand is the business case for it, is the focus on the regulatory approval and the lack of consideration for reimbursement and payer negotiation down the road, and doing all of this market intelligence and analytics, right? Again, regulatory approval only requires the addressing of 2 questions in a very holistic way, and that is it safe and is it effective? It does not address anything about comparative improvement over what healthcare systems are currently using.
Right.
And healthcare systems cannot afford it if you haven't articulated that. And they will say, no, I can't afford it. So you have to think through. That's undoubtedly the biggest mistake we see, is that companies are not considering commercialization early on. And the second one I'm starting to see emerge is the lack of an AI first approach. companies are trying to do things as normal and then backfilling AI in. It should be done the other way around now. It should be looking at it from an AI perspective and thinking how we can supplement that with our processes instead of doing it the other way around. So those, I think, are the two of the biggest things that we're starting to see.
All right. Well, and what I'm seeing from my point of view is, and it directly relates to what you mentioned, Richard, is that, and we're focusing on the second valley of debt. So companies are launching their product to market. They have investors backing up their product with a lot of money, and they eagerly need sales as soon as possible. So that they take on every distributor that knocks on their door, hey, I want to distribute your products, only to find out 1 or 2 or 3 years later that this distributor is not a match. And why is the distributor not a match? Because exactly what you just mentioned, Richard, the distributor doesn't have the market intelligence for his country at a level that is required for you as a manufacturer. And that is why a lot of manufacturers still want to work with the distributor, because the distributor does have that marketing intelligence for their specific region, for their market. And I think by having a combination of your AI tool with the skill set and the local knowledge of the market by a distributor, that's when you have a winning combination of bringing your product to market.
Absolutely. I think part of what we're talking about here is information asymmetry or symmetry, depending on how you want to look at it. But if one side of a negotiation's got far more information than another, the one with the more information is typically going to win, right? Artificial intelligence democratizes that information such that everyone can come with a level playing field, right? And I've seen instances where the payers at the information disadvantage. I've seen situations where the MedTech manufacturer is at the information disadvantage, or even a position where the distributor has got, like you said, the information advantage, and they're able to extract more or less margin from what they would otherwise be able to do, right? That's coming directly off the bottom line of the manufacturer themselves, right? So it's, to me, this is about providing transparency and information symmetry such that everyone can have a most effective discussion, right? And I think that's something we need to keep an eye on here, because ultimately, we have to remember why we're here. Patients need these solutions if there's a strong unmet need. So anything that bottlenecks a patient from getting something that's going to help or cure them, that's something that needs to be considered. And information symmetry allows us to speed up that process, but also make sure that the value is being recognized where it should.
Right. So translated that to distributor management, it means transparency through all processes about knowledge and sharing the knowledge. And that's exactly how we're approaching that in our masterclass as well, where you work together with a distributor on gathering market information, on creating a marketing plan, and definitely what you just showed us can support that, but can also be checking what the distributor is saying with what your data is giving. I'm not sure if that answers the question from the audience. There is another question. How does Vamstar's AI-enabled market intelligence compare with traditional market analysis approaches? Yeah,
so again, traditional marketing approaches or market intelligence assessments. And again, I've seen these done myself, right? You go to in some cases, you will go to a consulting company or go to a market intelligence company. You'll do X amount of interviews. You'll do whether it be price elasticity studies or whatever your conjoint analyses are that some consultant's going to just demonstrably overcharge you for, but they're only going to be as good as the sample from which you're pulling, right? So if let's say you interview 40 people, that's going to be a relatively expensive project, right? Depending on what you're building into it and how you want to cut the data. But let's say you're interviewing 40 people. Well, that's, again, across 6 stakeholder groups, which need to be considered. You're looking at just over 6 people per stakeholder group across, there's 20, 30 countries just in Europe, depending how you slice it in of itself, let alone all the APAC countries, the US market as well. Like, you just cannot get the number of top-down interviews and stakeholder insights, even in a quantitative way, that is anywhere near robust enough to make an effective commercial decision. Again, it comes back to one of the first slides here, which really comes down to this. I challenge you, and if you've found another one, by all means, let us know. But 86,000 buyers, 40 million contracts for 780 billion worth of purchasing decisions per day, right? That's not something that you would have had access to 5, 6 years ago. You just wouldn't. So,
Right, right. So another question from the audience. How long does it typically take to see measurable outcomes from AI-driven market intelligence tools?
yeah. So again, that's a good question, but it's also, I would repackage the question and say, what are you looking for from AI, right? You can see them almost instantly, right? So when I'm doing this from a Microsoft Surface Copilot enabled computer here. Literally within 10 minutes of turning it on, I could Google or I could Copilot, put some prompts in, and next thing you know, I'm generating stuff literally immediately, right? So that would definitely be a win. Now, I think the question behind the question is how long until you start to see a return on investment? Again, I think that comes to how much you want to embed things into your commercial solutions. And I think it also comes down to how much you want to focus on this versus the technology itself. But I personally believe that you can start to see the benefits of this in a very short period of time. And when I say that, I mean months, not years. So, but again, I think you need to scope out the project itself first, make sure you're aligned on those objectives, and the analytics are providing answers to the questions you need. And if it's doing that, you can start to see them literally within days with a return on investment within weeks or months.
All right. Another question. Are there product categories where AI-driven market access strategies have been successful?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the use case of AI might change depending on the risk category of the medical technology, for example. So when you see tender AI or pricing AI types of tools, those are fantastic for some of the higher volume, lower price technologies, right? Because you need to have a procurement focus. In many cases, the procurement decision is more important even than the physician decision, or it's even more important than the payer or HDA decision, right? So for high volume, lower price technologies, some of our tender and pricing AIs are fantastic tools. When you get into the value AI, that's when you can literally start to have an HTA sparring partner that says, okay, I'm launching a technology in, I don't know, in certain aneurysms. Okay, so now what evidence is required? What are the endpoints clinicians require? What are the cost per qualities that HTA organizations are looking at and evaluating it on? And that's when you can start to have that type of discussion. So I think it depends a little bit on the tool, but yes, the tool would vary depending on what the need is. But again, that's where Vamstar is. We're not selling a product. We are a partner in your commercialization tool. And that's where we can sit down and work with you through some of the boot camps that we've often run. So, yeah.
All right. Hey, this was the last question, at least that's what I'm seeing. If I can wrap up what we just discussed, Richard.
Yeah.
The takeaway is MedTech companies, whichever phase of the business they are, from startups to scale-ups to big multinationals, they need to have that the traditional basic elements of market intelligence. They need to know how to do that and how to interpret the data. But having AI is a tremendous way of getting more accurate data and real-time data. So it will be renewed. And what you're suggesting is start early. And we start early, start at the start phase of the life cycle of the product. When before you start designing your product, probably you already start using AI to do a proper market analysis of the economic benefits and the upside of your product to avoid any mismatch in the future.
That's exactly right. Yep.
All right. So that being said, because a lot of startups, when they are at this phase of ideation, they are raising money. They should include this as a part of the resources that they need, and not only in the funding to use this, but also knowledge-wise, what you said, hey, you need to have the right experts and expertise on board to do this.
So, and again, this is where organizational management and organizational performance becomes important. Again, I mentioned earlier the balanced scorecard type of approach, right? The balanced scorecard is a performance management tool, right? You can Google it in Harvard. It's by Robert Kaplan. I'm a huge proponent of it. There's only 4 components to it, and you align your KPIs to each of those 4 domains. The challenge then becomes, how do you internally manage your organization so that you don't get overwhelmed with data, right? And the second I hear you getting overwhelmed with data, I think there's a solution for AI, right? So now, if we turn around and look at it the other way, if I'm an investor and I want to invest in a company, am I going to invest in a company that's kind of doing it all, on the back of the napkin and doing it on 100 different Excel sheets? Am I going to invest in a company that is only focusing on regulatory, hasn't thought through the commercialization lens? Or am I going to invest in a company that's saying, let's look at the entire product lifecycle with the end goal in mind. Let's embed AI into this such that they're making much more rapid, much more effective decision making, and then are bringing that back to basic principles of performance management like the balanced scorecard, right? That is, to me, a far more investable company than one that's kind of running off and burning cash and doing all these different things. And again, that's where companies like Vamstar can come in and really support you to make sure that you're linking all of this together in an AI first way, not in a conventional business that is then looking to backfill AI into existing processes.
Right. Well, hey, thanks a lot, Richard. If the audience is interested in learning more, Vamstar is offering a boot camp, or what's the official name for it, but a session with you and your company to evaluate what the possibilities are applying their technology to your business. We at our end are offering you a free strategy call to dive into all the elements of distributor management and how to find the distributors, how to give them contracts. Yeah, this is a slide on the various masterclasses that we offer to help you get the knowledge and understanding on how to manage your distributors. So if you're interested, shoot me a link and we book a